Vale, pues ya está grabando.
Hola. ¿Se escucha? ¿Se escucha? ¿Así se escucha? Sí, sí, sí. ¿Se escucha bien? ¿Todos lados? Raúl, ¿se escucha? Ha molado mucho porque todos los que habéis venido habéis dicho toda esa cola es para ver a Seth. Ojalá, ¿no? Que no tiene nada que ver con que nos esté gobernando el fascismo hoy y nada, ¿eh? Porque no sé si os habéis enterado de que Castilla y León es la primera comunidad donde la extrema derecha empieza a gobernar. Así que toda esa cola no es para ver a Seth, pero somos los que estamos y estamos los que somos. Entonces, bueno, yo soy macarra y mi inglés es mucho más macarra, entonces no pinto nada aquí. A mí, personalmente, cuando hacemos la selección de libros anuales, se hace con muchísimo cuidado. No pretendemos ser nada canónicos ni nada. Cuando hacemos la selección de libros anuales siempre es una cosa que son los libros que nos han gustado, los libros de Letras Corsarias. Entonces, cuando pusimos Ventiladores Play hace 2 años como cómic del año, es porque nos pareció una auténtica obra maestra. Tener aquí a Seth, cosa que agradezco. Agradezco a Seth estar aquí, pero sobre todo agradezco a Catalina que lo ha hecho posible. Catalina es la editora de Salamanca Graphic y es la razón por la que, aunque hay una cola de mierda ahí hoy y aunque vos haya petado, tenemos la ocasión de tener a Seth y tenemos la ocasión de tener una conversación que a mí me parece única. Catalina, gracias. Sebe, gracias. Guau, chaval. Así que, bueno, muchísimas gracias. Va a ser una presentación que no se va a hacer muy larga porque le he pedido a Sebe que no haga unas transcripciones de las respuestas literales, sino que...
Gracias.
Sino que, bueno, sea una conversación que todos podéis disfrutar de Seth, que creo que realmente es un lujo tener a Seth aquí. Y que podéis firmar y tener un par de minutos con él y ya está, y que den por culo a vos y que den por culo a la cola de todos.
Bueno, nada, yo voy a decir 2 cosas, que ya Rafa lo ha dicho todo. Bueno, gracias a todos por venir. Muchísimas gracias a Letras Corsarias por una vez más pues apostar por la novela gráfica, apostar por autores, bueno, tanto nacionales como internacionales. En este caso es verdad que nos hacía muchísima ilusión que Seth viniera a Salamanca. Muchas gracias a Sebe porque sé que es un gran admirador de Seth y se conoce a fondo su obra, o sea que creo que va a ser una conversación muy interesante. Como los que habéis llegado pronto habéis visto, Seth dibuja en las dedicatorias y tarda un poco, entonces bueno, pediríamos si fuera posible que un libro por persona para firmar, para que todos puedan irse con su libro firmado, que es como lo interesante. Y nada, muchísimas gracias a todos y espero que disfrutéis de la charla entre Seth y Sebe.
Esto va, ¿no? Sí. Bueno, pues obviamente gracias a todos por venir.
es la primera vez que yo personalmente, y creo que en Letras Corsarias es la primera vez que viene un autor de cómic. You are the first very international non-Spanish author that we have here.
Oh, very nice.
It's really an honor for you here for more than one thing. Así que voy a estar un poco nervioso. I'm going to be a little nervous because it's my first time interviewing someone in English. Así que perdonad también un poco de pronunciación. Vamos a intentar que sea lo más fluido posible. Voy a intentar, va a ser un poco mix, una conversación entre español e inglés. Voy a intentar traducir todo lo posible, todo lo que pueda lo que diga Seth. Esperemos que no se quede todo los in translation, como la película de Sofía Coppola. Y lo de ser lo de siempre, yo le haré unas preguntas. Y luego imagino que tendremos tiempo, si es posible, para unas preguntas de vosotros. Seth, tenemos con nosotros esta tarde a Gregory Galán, más conocido como Seth, que es... there is a word really nice that we don't have here in Spanish. That is, I have read a lot about you, obviously, and they define you as a cartoonist. Mm-hmm. It's a really beautiful term, but we don't have here in Spanish. Que es cartoonist, que vendría a ser pues el que hace los cartoons, que es un término muy americano, que es un poco también tu obra. Your work is very influenced by the very first, the 30s, the 40s of the 20th century, the cartoons.
Yeah. Yes.
The cartoons of the panels from the newspaper, etc.
Yeah.
All that stuff. Y bueno, su trayectoria es muy dilatada. De hecho, tiene un premio por haber diseñado un libro de recopilación de las historias de Charles Perrault de Souls. Tiene varios premios, Ventiladores Clive y Dios Sprott, sobre todo Clive, de los dos libros que vamos a hablar. Ventiladores Clive está considerado, Rafa lo puso como del año, y esta, la crítica lo pone por las nubes. We're going to talk especially about Clive fans and Dios Sprott. Y bueno, la primera pregunta que le voy a hacer, the very first question is the very first question I ask to every author I have there, which is a question that I really always intrigues me as a writer. I'm always curious about why, what motivated you to write this comic book, and in this case especially because when Rafa told me you have to read this comic, it's the best comic of the year, it's one of my personal favorites, and I was okay. You got me, told me what is this about, and he told me it's about a company that builds fans, and it was like fans, like these things that spin and all that, and you have to read it. And obviously I read it, and well, on the surface, en la superficie, parece un cómic sobre dos hermanos churrades que tienen una tienda de ventiladores, pero luego es muchísimo más, habla de muchísimas cosas. You talk about the memory, about the pass of time, about the place where you live, the relationship with the place where you live. And ahora se lo voy a contar a él, pero os cuento primero a vosotros. Su cómic tiene el honor de haber sido el primer cómic que literalmente me ha hecho llorar. O sea, tuve que, después de un capítulo, el capítulo de 1966, tuve que dejar y cerrar el cómic y un rato a lidiar con las emociones que me estaba pasando, que es algo que nunca han hecho películas y algún otro libro, pero un cómic nunca. I was telling them that your comic has the honor of being the first comic book that hasn't made me cry.
That's very nice. It's very hard. It's hard to make anyone cry with a book. And even harder with a comic.
After the 1916 chapter, it's something that hits me really deep and personal because it's the chapter where Eve took her mother to the residence. I have let's just say I have a similar relationship with my mother that Simon has.
Yes, well, that's very much based on an experience of my own, of course.
Exactly, and it really shows.
Yeah.
So. Telling that Clive Fans is much more than a company about fans. What drove you to write this story? A story, an actual story that you took like 20 years to write.
Yes. Well, a lot of my work, when I describe it to anyone, sounds very boring. It's that because I think I'm drawn to very mundane subjects, like I like a reality that is, I'm drawn to things that are very old-fashioned and very quiet, and often in a culture like ours, which is very bombastic, these subjects sound terribly boring. Yeah. And do you want me to stop like now so you can talk? Or do you...
We can do that.
Yeah, you go. Yeah.
Bueno, lo que ha dicho básicamente es que es verdad que sus cómics parecen de algo mundano, pues eso, lo que Rafa me dijo, un cómic sobre una compañía de ventiladores, como, pero tío, sí, lételo. Pero claro, él dice también que es muy cierto que con estos tiempos tan bombásticos que tenemos, que es un término que tampoco tenemos aquí, es una palabra que me encanta, bombastic, que es curioso un cómic que vaya sobre algo tan mundano. Guillermo, cuando he has to be like that, told me when they asked about the comic, told something that is, I think, it conveys your work really well. You transform the mundane into art.
Well, the thing is, a lot of the times, how would I put this? I'm drawn to a subject that at first is a very superficial reason why I'm drawn to it, but usually, like Clyde Fann's being a perfect example. I saw the storefront, which was the actual store, which was Clyde Fann's. There was a real business named that, and I just was interested in like, what is this old business? And when I looked into the window, there were two photographs in the back, and these were the two men I assumed who had owned the business when it was still open. But that, that's just the beginning of any kind of story. Usually, what happens in the process is a lot of your personal life. Over a period of a year, when you think about it, like any writing, your own life enters into the story, your own experiences. By the time you come out the other end, the story is usually more about you than whatever it was that originally attracted you. The same is for both of these books. George Sprott is very much about a certain kind of TV personality I've seen as a child. Clyde Fann's was about an actual place I saw, but in the end, they're really about my life.
After all, we wrote about always we wrote.
Yes.
We write about our personal experience, about us.
Exactly.
Bueno, básicamente es curioso. So we can tell that Clyde Fann is based theoretically in a real story.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Que Ventiladores Clyde es una tienda que vio él y que se fijó en una tienda que estaba ya cerrada, que era un negocio antiguo, y miró por la ventana y vio pues dos retratos de las dos personas que él supuso que eran los propietarios, que al final se convertirían en Abe y en Simon. Y claro, es un poco al final de que eso fue el detonante de la historia. Pero lo que nos pasa a todos los que escribimos, cuando me pagan a veces por escribir, al final acabas escribiendo de tus propias experiencias, acabas escribiendo de lo que te pasa a ti. Tienes un detonante, pues que en el caso de Ventiladores Clyde fue esa tienda, y en el caso de Josh Sprout es esa personalidad televisiva de los años 30, 40, pero al final se acaban de tus experiencias. So I suppose, yeah, especially when Clyde Fann's is a journey through 2 decades.
Yes. I didn't plan it to be 2 decades. I mean, nobody plans to write a story that they work that long on. The truth is, I thought it would take me about 5 years to do that story. And of course, I didn't work on the book for 20 years. I mean, it's like, it would be a much, much bigger book if you worked on something every day for 20 years. It was because I only worked on it a little bit each year. I probably turned out about, maybe 40 pages a year or something. And at a certain point, at the beginning, the slowness of how I was producing the book felt perfectly normal. I just felt I was working on a lot of projects, and I'd work on it when I felt like it. And at about 10 years, I started to feel a little worried that it was taking like double the amount of time I had planned. At the 15-year mark, I was very embarrassed by the book because people would ask me, like, when is the second book, or when is the book going to be done? And I would always avoid the question. I would be like, oh, well, I'm working on it. It's good. But the funny thing, and so I never wanted to talk about Clyde Fann. So I knew it would get done if I lived long enough. But I was embarrassed that I was turning up many other projects at the same time, but for some reason this book went on and on and on. But when it was finally done, I felt this, beyond the relief of it was done, there was the other aspect, is that at some point I started to feel kind of like it was great that it took 20 years. I felt like it was a great achievement of some sort, that I'd spent so much time on one book.
Yeah, 20 years.
Yeah, I think I might have won the lottery for the longest graphic novel. So,
probably.
Yeah, for how long it took to make it. So, although I think there's another graphic novel, Berlin, which took almost the same amount of time, but I think I took a little longer.
So you have the record for the boss.
I think, but fingers crossed.
Bueno, hemos estado hablando de que claro, al principio él se sentía un poco preocupado de que el cómic, pues, él pensaba, quería que le iba a tomar 5 años hacerlo, claro. Pasan los 5 años, bueno, seguimos en ello. Pasa a los 10 años y era como, llevo el doble de tiempo. Empiezo a estar un poco más preocupado y a los 15 ya era cada vez que le preguntaban al pobre sobre Clive Fans, él le esquivaba la pregunta, que era como, no, sí, estoy en ello. Y ya, claro, ha contado también que es un gran relief, una gran sensación de satisfacción de haberlo acabado por fin. Y de cómo es posible que eso, que junto con Berland sean de los 2 cómics más largos. Pero yo creo, I think that it really fits the comic, that it took you 20 years to... It's a slow comic, that talks about memory, about the passage of time. So I think it really shows that it took you too long.
Yeah, I mean, obviously for me, I can't read it the way a person who's reading the book. For me, it's always going to be about a project that I see in pieces because it took so long. I look at the work and it's very, the beginning of the book looks so different to the end of the book. I see all the struggle that was in the book. But I've had lots of people tell me that they don't, that the experience of reading it where the artwork changes adds to the experience for them.
Exactly.
I'm grateful. Exactly. It doesn't add to it for me. It's always an interesting experience how other people interpret your work. For myself, there's a kind of perfect ideal you wish the work to be, and you never achieve that under any no project ever succeeds at reaching the excitement you feel about it when you begin it. There's always a perfect moment where the next book is going to be perfect, a beautiful thing, the greatest book ever written. And of course, when the book is done, it's all the elements of compromise to make work of art. I remember with my first book, It's a Good Life If You Don't Weaken, I remember Art Spiegelman told me that he read the book and he didn't really care for it particularly, but then when he found out that it was a fiction instead of a real story, he thought it was a much better book, and he liked it much better. And so it's very funny, something that I was trying to hide turned out to be the element of it that he thought made it better. To me, I thought finding out about the fiction element of it would be deflate the balloon. So it's always, you can't really anticipate what the reader will experience.
You can, of course, we can. The way we read, we watch our work is very different. It's how the reader, how the public see it. But it's curious because exactly you can never anticipate, never think about how, and every person see your work from another perspective.
Absolutely.
Bueno, básicamente, pues eso, él nos está hablando de que él tenía una idea de ventiladores Clyde, que era su idea ideal, pero claro, luego cuando llega al público es distinta, hablando sobre todo de los cambios de arte, porque obviamente en 20 años el estilo de alguien cambia, y se nota mucho en ese primer capítulo en el que nos explica, está hablando de cómo es ser comercial, pero realmente está hablando de muchas más cosas. De hecho, yo que trabajo comercial, it's something that curious. The first chapter, where Abe explains the life of a salesman, I'm working right now as a salesman, and it's really accurate about how superiors teach about how to sell. It's really accurate. I was reading it, I was like, I don't know if I feel good, if I feel bad because I'm at work again. Y es un poco como, pues al final la obra que recibe el espectador es distinta, el lector es distinta. Por ejemplo, con su primer trabajo, él dijo que habló con Art Spiegelman, que casi nadie, ¿sabes? Y le dijo que cuando se enteró que su primer trabajo era una obra de ficción, que le pareció mucho mejor, porque la primera vez que se lo leyó pensó que era algo real, que estaba basado en un hecho real, y dijo, bueno, pues vale, pero cuando se enteró que era ficción, dijo, pues mucho mejor. Es eso, que no podemos recibirlo como... Se habla de cómo no puedes controlar, no puedes anticipar cómo el público recibe tu obra. Que es algo de una colación porque el ventilador es Clyde y se notan esos cambios de arte, esos cambios de dibujo, obviamente. Es algo que le pega al libro, no estoy de acuerdo. El libro lo veréis. Este dibujo del primer capítulo del comercial es muy distinto al que vemos luego en el capítulo de los años 70 y muy distinto al maravilloso capítulo final. Okay, so...
What you were saying about sales, it's interesting. When I started the book, I didn't know anything about sales. I'd never worked in sales, but I got a lot of old books from salesmen telling them how to be better salesmen. In North America, there's a tremendous amount of books published on sales, and always have been. And the ones from the 50s and 60s.
In North America, there was this culture of the traveling salesman.
Yes, exactly.
During the 50s and the 60s.
Oh, yes. And those books were surprisingly interesting because there was a wide variety of different types of books on sales. There were ones that told you how to be a good ethical salesman, and there were other books that told you how to manipulate people so you could force them to buy things.
I can tell you that right now, at least in my job, we are inclining towards the manipulative.
Okay, I believe it. But the best book I read was this one book that was called something like 100 best sales ever made, and they were individual short stories, just very short stories, from 100 different salesmen telling about the best sale they ever made. And to some degree, there was a lot of it was bragging and showing off, but there was that really was the book that I read where I felt like this taught me something about sales, because it was really very straightforward about here's what went wrong, here's what went right, here's how you do it, here are the 5 things to do. It was I occasionally read that book just for fun. Yeah.
Well, I can tell you that things have changed obviously since the 1960s, but
Sure.
it's scarcely accurate about my real job. Bueno, hemos estado hablando de que él no tenía ni idea de los libros para vender, pero bueno, es cierto que en Estados Unidos hay esta cultura del viajero, del viajante. La famosa obra de muerte del viajante, por ejemplo, es esa cultura del vendedor, que es un poco lo que está en el Tiradores Clay también. Y estuve leyendo varios libros que te enseñaban a ser un vendedor ético, que es algo que me temo no está muy de moda ahora, lamentablemente, y libros que te enseñan a ser un vendedor manipulativo, es decir, que aprovechas cómo manipular las emociones de la gente para vender. Y que el que más le pareció curioso, que incluso lo sigue leyendo ahora por diversión, es uno que era las 100 mejores ventas que se han hecho, que eran pequeñas historias de cómo, pues eso, de varios vendedores que vendían esta siempre mejor venta. Y un poco a partir de ahí aprenderías cómo vender. Okay, more things about... so it all started with this story, with this...
It's funny.
place.
Yeah, I mean, the book was started so long ago that it was a different time of comics when I started it.
Mm-hmm.
And when I started it, this would be in the late 90s, 1990s. And comics have come a long way since the late 1990s. There's been a tremendous amount of work done and so many new, vital, exciting cartoonists. But when I started that book, it was still early enough in a time when people were trying to make adult work in comics that, for me, one of the big things was I was trying to write about things that hadn't really been written about much in comics, and one of them was work. I wanted to talk about work.
Mundane work.
Very little of literature is actually about work. People's jobs are mentioned in the stories, but for a great deal of stories, the story takes place away from where they work.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk about the life of work because it's so important to all of us. But the other elements that I was working with in that book have come to be my main themes, which is mostly about memory.
Memory, yeah.
And I think that's really what Clive Fans is about.
Sí. I totally agree. It's about memory.
Yeah.
How the passage of time
Yes.
influence us, how our memory changes, how our memories are illusions in reality.
Mm-hmm. And that world of memory is so powerful. Certainly for me, I wanted to have characters that were really, their lives were infused with memory. And I was also very interested in place. I wanted the fact that they're in this one building was there. I wanted to inhabit that place in a comic in the way that you might in other mediums, like in a play or in a film, where you go through the same space over and over again until you get to know the space, rather than it just being a backdrop for the story. The place was very important to me, and increasingly I feel like the work I'm doing now maybe even is more interested in place than it was then. Sometimes I think I'm more interested in place than I am in characters.
Well, I think this is a little topic. It's one sentence that I have seen in most films, in some films and some books, but in your comic, the places are almost like a character.
Yes, I do feel that. I like increasingly the landscape and the environment where the story takes place I just feel like sometimes that I'm more focused on that, sometimes even than the characters. The current book I'm working on is very, very focused on places. Yeah.
Because every place has a story to tell.
Yes.
Bien.
Yes.
Bueno, hemos estado comentando que Ventilador Clive, de que él, curiosamente, cuando empezó en los cómics sobre el año finales de los 90, principios del 2000, quería hablar de algo que no se hablaba de los cómics, y es verdad, que es sobre el trabajo. Normalmente, pues los personajes de cómics suelen trabajar. De hecho, hasta Spider-Man trabaja como fotógrafo, por ejemplo, Flash como periodista, pero no se suele ver en los cómics, en todo tipo de cómics, incluso en los cómics más americanos o más tipo superhéroes, o los cómics más indies, no se suele hablar del trabajo. Los personajes trabajan, pero no se ve dónde trabajan y no se habla del trabajo. Él quería escribir un cómic sobre el trabajo, que es un poco también lo que se habla en Ventiladores Clive, pero también eso se transforma después en lo que estoy completamente de acuerdo con la gente que ha dicho que es uno de sus temas principales, que es la memoria. El paso del tiempo. Ventiladores Clive empieza hablando de cómo vender ventiladores y acaba hablando de cómo la memoria, no sé si se me escucha. ¿Se me escucha bien? No sé, que no estoy acostumbrado a los micros. Cómo se habla como de la memoria, cómo del paso del tiempo nos afecta, cómo las memorias que tenemos realmente son ilusiones que no se asemejan a la realidad, de cómo vivimos de esas memorias. Los dos hermanos de Ventiladores Clive, y Simon, están fuertemente ligados y obsesionados incluso con esas memorias de sus padres. Y también en Ventiladores Clive se habla mucho de los lugares, que también ha contado que su siguiente libro está muy relacionado con los lugares, de cómo los lugares tienen su propia historia, de que a veces los lugares, que eso lo he dicho yo, que es una frase muy típica y muy manida, pero es verdad que en Ventiladores Clive, ahora lo vamos a ver en Letras también, los lugares son como un personaje más, están tratados como un personaje más, como con su memoria, con sus recuerdos. El último capítulo de Ventiladores Clive, el último capítulo, es todo o sea, no hay prácticamente personajes en todos los lugares. I was telling them about your fantastic last chapter of Clive Fans.
Oh, okay.
With this, it's all about places.
Yes.
This,
Yeah. It's funny. Clive Fans, it took 20 years to do, and I didn't write the whole story at the beginning. But I did know exactly what was going to happen in the story very clearly. I knew every detail, and the book ends on the exact line that I planned to end it on.
Which is a really powerful line, obviously.
Yes, I was happy, yes, and happy that I got to that point, and felt still happy when I got it. You know, working on a book for such a long time, when you get to the end, it could be a tremendous disappointment. You know, it's a very old project. But so whereas the story didn't change any, how I told the story really changed over those 20 years. So I knew what the last chapter would be, and I knew what I wanted the last chapter to be. But I feel like it almost took me 20 years to get to the point where I was able to pull off the last chapter in the way that I wanted to do it. I think if I'd done it like in 5 years, the whole book, the last chapter would have still been the same. But I think it would have been, I wouldn't have done it the same way, and I wouldn't have been as happy with it. I know what I would have done back then, because I did a very short strip around the same time, which was kind of my idea on how I would end the book. And I can compare the two works and see how they're connected. But I think some things happen in their own time. So I was very happy to finish the book at the right time in my life.
One can change.
Yeah.
One can change a lot.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Hablando del último capítulo, él dijo que él tenía pensado un poco cómo iba la historia, pero que tenía más o menos pensado ese final. Y eso es lo que estaba diciendo ahora, que es que el último capítulo final es muy bueno, en serio. Si os habéis leído el cómic y si no os habéis leído, veedlo, porque el último capítulo es maravilloso. Que él ha comparado las notas que tenía de cuando tenía pensado acabar el proyecto hace 5 años con el capítulo final, porque tenían miedo, obviamente. Todos los que creamos, todos los que escribimos, o hagamos una obra artística, narrativa, siempre tenemos miedo del final. El final es lo que te puede expropiar una historia, como hemos visto muchas veces en libros, en películas, en cómics, en todo obra narrativa, al final puedes expropiarlo todo. Pero lo tenía más o menos claro, y dice que comparando las notas de cuando tenía pensado acabarlo en 5 años con cómo acabó, es cierto que eso estaba ahí, pero obviamente en 20 años todo cambia. Y que en el fondo se alegra de haberlo hecho, de haber tardado 20 años, porque está muy contento con el final que ha tenido, pero sobre todo con esa última y poderosa línea que cierra toda la historia. We have talked about places, and George Sprott, there are a lot that, in fact, you have created like a fictional, what Dominion is like a reduced fictional space where the comic culture explore also takes place. And what motivated you to? Let's start with the very first question, my favorite question.
Yeah.
What drove you to work in a TV star of the 40s, 30s?
Yeah.
A guy who traveled to the Antarctic and
It's not like that was a topic of particular interest to me. It's not like I might, in like some that I was drawn. I thought, like, before I die, I have to write a story where the character is a TV host. That was not of any great importance to me. It just was a kind of a funny coincidence or a circumstance that George Sprott's a slightly different book in a way than I usually work because it had been commissioned, in the sense that the New York Times called me and asked me if I would like to do a strip for them. So at that point, I was required to come up with an idea. In fact, they called me like literally like the week that I said, like, I'm not taking on any more work. I have to finish Clive Vance. But when they called, it was just too good of a job to say no. So I said yes, and I had a very, very vague idea for a script. And it was only because I think I was in my mid-40s. It was probably around the time I was having my midlife crisis. And I thought, I'd been looking back on my childhood. And I remember, I was thinking of all the television shows I used to watch, very local television, and how much I loved television as a teenager and a child. And I remembered a particular TV host who was in our area, a very old, fat man who was very boring, and I never would have watched this show, except there was nothing else on television. And suddenly I was thinking about him at exactly that moment when they asked me to do this strip. And so he just rose to the surface as a possible subject. But of course, the book is, takes on a life that's quite different from your initial, that first thing. That's just like the spark of a story. He could have been anything. He could have been, he could have been an old band leader, or he could have been a garbage man. It doesn't really matter. The point was, because I was trying to deal more with the complexity of George and who he was.
It's practically the same as Clive Vance. A little show, a fun show. Now a TV, a all fan.
Yeah, there's a certain randomness to it.
The spark of the story. Bueno, hemos visto también, pues estaba preguntando sobre el otro cómic del que estamos hablando, Joseph Sprott, que va de un presentador de televisión muy típico de la época dorada de la televisión de Estados Unidos, años 30, 40, 50, 60, también un poco ya en la decadencia, que dice que pasó un poco lo mismo, que pasó un poco lo mismo con el tirador Clive. Es un encargo que le hizo el New Yorker y que él se acuerda de su niñez y cómo veía a un presentador de televisión local, una televisión muy pequeñita, que era un viejo gordo, aburrido, como es George Sprott, y que a partir de ahí surgió una chispa en la que empezó la historia. Empieza con esa historia de este presentador, pero bueno, o como pasa con Ventiladores Clive. En el principio puede ser un poco más sugerente, un presentador de televisión puede atraer un poco más una tienda de ventiladores, pero al final es lo mismo. Es esa misma idea de empezamos con un presentador de televisión y acabamos pues hablando de muchas cosas más. And with Joseph Sprott, it happened to me too with Clive Vance, because I'm more of the Simon team, and I totally space. I don't have brothers, but I have friends like a relationship Simon with Abe. And with George Sprott, it's happening even further. And George is something that in the beginning you don't like him.
Yes.
But through the course of the story, you know him, you start to know him. In fact, it's funny how you use the use of the unrelevant narrator in the Joseph Sprott comic. It's wonderful. And you start to know him. How do you do it? How can you transform something so unlikable at the beginning to the point where someone you see is at the end we are a human person and we are all of our light and our shadows, but in the end, I don't say you love George, but you understand him.
Yes, I wanted to use with George. I wanted to use a sort of character that he's not an evil person. He's kind of a bad person, but he's not. He's more like he's just like many of us, a careless person, selfish. He didn't really worry about what wreckage he was leaving behind himself in life. But I also wanted to have a character who didn't come to terms with it. Someone who wasn't, he didn't regret things. Maybe he regretted things deeply, but he wasn't going to look close enough to know that he regretted things.
The classic story where he has a revelation and he suddenly thinks, "Oh, I'm a bad person. I'm going to change."
Yeah. George thinks of himself as a good person. I don't think I've ever met anyone who didn't think they were a good person. Even if in your own life, if you go out and you meet someone and you go away and you think they really didn't like me, they thought I was a jerk. You don't think I'm a jerk. You think they don't understand me. If they knew me better, they would like me.
Because I am a good person.
Yes, exactly. At best, you might. Maybe you would think you might go home and think like, "Oh, am I a jerk?" But I think most of the time you think, "Oh, if they knew me better, they would know I'm a good person." And George is like that. He's left a lot of wreckage in his life, but he's selfish and he's not inward looking. But I also wanted you to have empathy for George. I didn't want you to come away and say like, "Oh, George is a wonderful person and we forgive him everything." We don't forgive him. But I wanted you to feel towards him like you might feel towards someone in your own family, that you think like, "Oh, they have terrible opinions," or "I fight with them all the time," but I understand them and I forgive them. And that's very different than you feel towards people you just meet in the street. And I think that, ultimately, if you could really empathize with everyone, you would kind of forgive everyone, but it doesn't mean you would like them. And that's what I wanted from George, because, that's a certain kind of experience you have in life. And for me, much of it, I was thinking of my own father. And that's the kind of relationship I had with him.
Yeah. We told before, we use our own experience.
Exactly.
And it's a really nice thought that if you could understand people better, if we could empathize more, which is one of the themes I extracted from George.
Oh, good.
In the end, I understand you. You understand George. You don't forgive him because he, as you said, left a wreckage and
and he doesn't learn.
He doesn't learn, exactly.
He doesn't learn.
He doesn't learn anything.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Pues hablando un poco de George Sprout, que yo le pregunté que cómo es posible, cómo logra, que también es algo que hemos hablado mucho aquí, qué pasa con Abe en Ventiladores Clive, que yo no me cae bien Abe. He conocido demasiada gente como Abe, yo soy más del equipo Simon, como he dicho, del hermano tímido, callado y tal. Pero es verdad que al final acabas entendiendo tanto a Abe y sobre todo a George, porque George, además, el libro hace una cosa maravillosa que te va contando la vida de George con un narrador, con una reliable narrator, hace un recurso muy divertido, que hay un narrador que te cuenta la historia, pero incluso el mismo narrador omnisciente te dice, yo es que no me acuerdo muy bien de los detalles. Y al final vas viéndolo todo, vas con entrevistas a otras personas que trabajaron con él, y al final te vas construyendo esta figura de este tipo que no te cae bien, porque es verdad que, como él dice, ha dejado un wreckage, tiene una hija perdida en el norte de la que pasa de ella, pero luego te das cuenta en el cómic que sí es cierto que un poco la recuerda. Acabas empatizando con él, acabas diciendo, sí, a ver, por decirlo mal y pronto, eres un cabrón, pero a ver, tampoco eres malvado. Porque es verdad que lo que hemos hablado, nadie piensa que es malvado, todos pensamos que somos la buena persona. Yo creo que incluso hasta el mismísimo Putin, la redundancia, piensa que es bueno, aunque esté haciendo lo que está haciendo. Todos pensamos que es bueno. Cuando alguien te dice, eres un gilipollas, tú piensas, ¿cómo voy a ser yo gilipollas? Lo que pasa es que no me conoce bien. Sí puedes pensar un poco, como ha dicho él, dices, realmente es un gilipollas, pero dices, no, que es un poco lo que le pasa a George, que también es un poco soplo de aire fresco, porque bueno, que hace un pequeño spoiler del cómic también. Espero que lo hayáis leído. Joseph Brown es la típica historia que de repente, pues él dice, vale, me he dado cuenta en mi lecho de muerte de que he sido una mala persona y tengo que cambiar y tal. No. George sigue pensando hasta el final que él lo ha hecho bien, que es un tipo simpático, que al fondo lo es. O sea, todos hemos conocido a alguien como Joseph Brown. Y al final es eso, al final, que de hecho es un pensamiento muy positivo, que logras empatizar con él y dices, vale, no te perdono porque has hecho mucho el cabrón, pero tampoco eres mala persona, tampoco eres mal tipo. Which is something good. We are not... Define persons in terms of good or evil is always too binary. We are full of light and shadows, which is another of the things I see in your books. There are books very, very human. You talk about mundane things, and we all know the same things, and in the end, you can empathize with the character. You can think you don't like him, you don't like it, you can even not like Simon, but you understand them. And it's something this really, really hard to do.
Oh, well, thank you. That's very nice.
It's true.
But the funny thing, it's interesting that people write in different writers write different kinds of stories.
Of course.
And I don't think I knew this when I was young, that you don't really get maybe to pick the kind of stories you write. You sort of figure them out by writing them. And you figure certain things out as you get older, that there are certain kinds of stories you're not going to write, too. One of the kinds of stories I'm not going to write is a story about a big family or a big group of people. I look at someone like Jaime Hernandez, and he writes stories about tremendous numbers of people. They're all interconnected, big families. And he grew up in a big family with lots of siblings and cousins, and it's a big part of his life and his world still. But I grew up in a very closed little world of just mother and father and me, and that I feel like has influenced my mind so deeply that I only write stories like that. Very few characters, a couple of people, and a kind of book like Clyde Fans, where you've really got three characters, or George, where maybe you have two characters, maybe a few. Everyone else is an incidental character, but George and his niece, and maybe his dead wife. These kind of, it's like you at a certain point you realize those are the kind of stories you're going to write, and that what you're talking about is kind of the same thing over and over again. You can fight against that. You can say like, well, I'm not going to do that again. The next book's going to be about ghosts in outer space. But it's probably they'll end up being, two lonely ghosts who are talking about the end of life or something.
Talking about each other for all eternity, about
exactly.
relationships.
Yeah. It's very hard to get away from it. But I think the thing is, I think it's good to embrace that. I think that I like the idea that I'm writing the same kind of story because I feel like what I'm doing in this process is getting to know myself. I don't think I think of myself as a person now that I would not have thought I was at the age of 25. If you talked to me then and asked me who I was, I think I would give you a very, very different answer. And it's not because of life experience, of all necessarily the things that have happened to me. It's this writing process of writing the stories and what kind of stories I'm writing and what that eventually tells me about myself.
I think we can't choose what we are going to write. Yeah, you can want to write about superheroes or about anything, and you end writing about something that's
the same
your feels, your experience.
Yes, I agree. The same themes return, even if you try to get away
Even
from
if you
them.
try to get away. And fighting against that is troublesome.
Yes.
I have tried. I try to, and in the end, I always write about the same things. And I think all the people that write have created narrative works. We like what we like. We are what we are, and you are what you write.
Yeah, and it kind of takes a lifetime too to figure out. Like when I was young, I thought like, okay, I took the good advice, which is write the story you want to read. It takes you a really long time to figure out how to write a story you want to read. The first few times, it turns out it's the last story you want to read. You're like, I will never read that again.
This is shit.
Yeah, and I do think that it's because you don't really know what the ideal story is you'd like to read. It takes a long time to even figure that simple thing out.
Yeah. Bueno, hemos hablado un poco también de cómo, lo que estamos hablando ahora, de que al final tú acabas escribiendo un poco de lo mismo. Es verdad que sus obras son muy parecidas porque, el ejemplo que ha puesto él cuando tiene 25 años, si le preguntan con 25 años qué tipo de persona es, no va a ser la misma respuesta obviamente que vas a dar ahora, por todo lo que ha escrito, más que por lo que ha vivido, también por todo lo que ha escrito, porque escribir es verdad que te va descubriendo un poco cómo eres. Y el ejemplo que ha puesto muy divertido, que yo quiero escribir una historia sobre fantasmas en el espacio. Pues podría intentarlo para que vea escribiendo una historia sobre dos fantasmas que son hermanos o que son amigos y acaban hablando de sus relaciones y de la memoria. Que es un poco también el tema que está muy presente, sobre todo en el tirado de Clyde, el tema de quiénes somos, de quién eres. It is, to summarize, I think one of the related to what we're talking to, related to Clyde fans in the end, is also about who we are, about who we are, the question, Simon, are you there? And the answer, yes, I am.
Yes. Well, I do think identity is a super important issue to me. A lot of Clyde fans too is, of course, because I'm dealing with two characters that are kind of two separate parts of my own identity. I'm thinking about identity a lot. You've got Abraham and you've got Simon. Abraham is very outgoing. He's an extrovert. He's the salesman, and you've got Simon, who is the introvert. I mean, this is a typical kind of writer's thing, where you just take two characters and you give each one of them part of your personality. For me, it's a very pronounced schism because I'm a very social person. I'm a very talkative person. I'm not a shy person. I enjoy the company of other people, but I spend all my life alone. I work in the studio by myself, and I like it that way. And I think the funny thing is, I wouldn't have planned it that way, though. If you'd asked me when I was quite young, what would you want to do for your life, I probably wouldn't have said I'd like to mostly be alone, because I really enjoyed other people's company. But now I see, like, sometimes things turn the way you want them to, and all of that time alone gives you a tremendous amount of time to think about experience and who you are, identity. And it's interesting, if you spend a lot of time alone, you recognize that you're very comfortable with your own identity because you're just by yourself. It's only when you deal with other people when you start to feel bad about yourself. That's when you start to feel yourself reflected back. That's when you start to feel like that's not your real self. When you're alone, it's always your real self. That's an experience I find very gratifying to be by myself. I come out on a tour like this. I go home and I'm very depressed. It's damaging to talk to other people in many ways. But the thing is, it's like, where do you place who are you, though? This is the essential problem in being a human being, is who are you? And I think that to a degree in both of these books, all of the characters are trying to define who they are. Their lives, the choices they make, whether they're retreating from the world or advancing on it, whether they're using other people, whatever they're doing, looking for ego gratifications, it's very much about, like, a person who is saying, who am I? And I think that's why the stories also sort of deal with end-of-life ideas. Because at the end of the life, that's the essential question. Two questions. Who am I? Why? What was it all about? And so much of that is a kind of a human defined experience, something we're making up. There may not be anything to it at all. Is there a meaning to it, like what our time here on Earth was? That's very much a human question, but it's very much a kind of a writer's question too, because your own life is a story that you're making up. And does the story pay off? What's it about? Who are you? These are the questions that so many books are about, and there's a good reason why we keep coming back to it.
Because we spend our lives trying to find out who we are.
Absolutely.
I think that's the meaning of life, trying to find out who you are.
I do.
Hemos estado hablando, pues, también de cómo estos dos cómics también van mucho sobre la identidad. Cuento una cosa muy curiosa, de que Ventiladores Clyde, los dos hermanos, que es algo también que se suele hacer mucho, son dos aspectos de su personalidad. Que la contento que es una persona, como podemos ver, que le gusta hablar, es muy extrovertida, como es Sale, que es el vendedor, es la persona que le gusta hablar con la gente, pero también tiene una parte de Simon, que es la parte que luego se va a su casa, le gusta estar solo. Y es verdad, también un poco, a mí me pasa un poco también lo mismo, y creo que a todos nos pasa. Hay gente más extrovertida y más introvertida, pero es lo que hemos dicho también, cuando estás solo contigo mismo, es cuando puedes llegar a averiguar quién eres. Porque es cierto, and I think it's something about you tell about when you are with others. I always use the analogy that when you are with others, you are wearing a mask. It's something, there is a saying in Japanese that tells us we all wear different masks. And when you are alone, you can take this mask off and see exactly who you are. And that can be a frightening thought. Y eso está muy presente en los dos cómics también. Habla muchísimo de la identidad. Y de cómo al final, lo que nos pasa con muchos, que es algo que se ve perfectamente en su obra, es que nos pasamos intentando buscar quiénes somos. Tanto Abe como Simon, como sobre todo George. George se pasa toda su vida intentando, en el fondo, buscar quién es. No sabemos si al final lo averigua o no. Es una cosa que dice el cómic, también el narrador. Eso se lo deja a ustedes. Pero bueno, ahí está la pregunta. Y bueno, no sé cuánto tiempo llevamos, pero supongo que podremos dar un tiempo a si alguien tiene alguna pregunta. Intentaré traducirla lo mejor posible. We're going to see I think this talk about identity is perfect to end
Sure.
the questions, and we are going to see someone has a question.
Okay.
¿Alguien tiene alguna pregunta?
Why did you change the name of Seth?
Oh yes, yes. That's an old story because I changed my name when I was, maybe 21 years old, and it has a lot to do with the fact that I grew up in a very small town, and I moved to the big city. And when I came to the big city, I really wanted to be a new person. I've not been happy with my life as a child, and especially in the small town. And I went to art school, and I became a punk rocker. And I was like looking to be. I had a very kind of very exaggerated look.
I don't know if we can imagine you as
I was. I had a lot of white hair. Yeah. And I was like, yes, a very scary kind of look. And I wanted a very scary kind of gothy sort of name. So I renamed myself Seth. It was it could have been worse, but that's the name I picked, and I forced everyone to call me that. And it's been a long time now that I've had the name Seth, and I rarely think about it anymore. But if I do think about it, I always think it's a mistake. I always think like I liked my old name. It's a good name. My name was Gregory Gallant, and it's a nice name. But it's like so long ago, it's too late to change back. So I just, it's one of those things, a remnant of youth.
Bueno, pues le ha preguntado, que es una pregunta muy, muy buena, de por qué el nombre de Seth. Y él ha dicho que algo que nos va a costar imaginarlo, que de joven era todo un puncarra, por decirlo en un término clásico, que tenía el pelo blanco y tal, como otras personas que yo conozco, y que quería, cuando fue a la gran ciudad, que se le conociera por un nombre como más poderoso, más gótico, más gothic, y decidió el nombre de Seth. Que bueno, que ahora es un poco como, se arrepiente un poco, pero bueno, ya se quedó, le gusta su nombre. It's a really nice name, Gregory Gallant. It's something contrary to Seth.
Yeah.
Absolutely the opposite.
Yeah.
Pero claro, ya se ha quedado, pues bueno, pues ahora ya le conocemos todos como Seth en el mundo del cómic. ¿Alguna pregunta más?
In the comic of Ventiladores Clyde, do you use a vignette with lamp, stairs, or lighthouse? What is the meaning of this?
In which book?
In Clyde Fans, there are some panels with a lighthouse, a lamp.
Oh, yes. I don't think I would explain it. I think there's always a danger of explaining what things mean in a book. And so I usually resist that. I feel like there's often you're working in comics too, because it's a visual language. There's often a lot of visual motifs you will reuse that kind of become themes or connecting points between a story where you will return to the same images. But I don't like to give away my secrets.
A magician de his secrets.
Yeah.
La pregunta ha sido de por qué en algunas viñetas de Ventiladores Clyde pues aparecen unos paneles, unas viñetas con una lámpara, un faro, etcétera, con ese significado. Y algo que no estoy de acuerdo respondido, que a veces no hay por qué explicarlo todo. Y a veces hay que dejar un poco conectan, es cierto que esas imágenes conectan y que no hay que explicar los secretos de la profesión, que un buen mago nunca revela sus secretos. Porque además yo creo que se pierde un poco la magia del cómic. Además, una cosa que tiene muy buena también, something that has really good in your books, is that it's really open to the reader interpretation.
Yeah, that's always difficult. Like when you're writing a book, you want to leave spaces open for readers to interpret things. But it's also difficult because you're never quite sure if you're leaving too much in or too much out, because you'll never be able to read the book like a reader. The book, that's what I was saying earlier about that advice of write the book you want to read. The problem with that is you can't stand reading your own work, and it's like because you wrote it, it will never be the story you want to read.
And you know everything.
Yes, exactly.
The
book has no real life to it when you wrote it. It's just a kind of a Frankenstein monster. You stitched it together. And you will always look at it and see all the elements he used and put in it. It's like you can't. It's kind of a shame. It's like any artist you really love, any writer you really love, you recognize they're the one person who never got to enjoy their work.
I really hate reading what I wrote. I totally hate it.
Yeah.
Because I hate it and I say, it is awful. This is because you know it, you know the process, you know the secrets.
You see all the seams.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Pues eso, que es muy difícil leer algo que tú has escrito. Que es lo que le preguntaba yo un poco. Porque claro, saber los secretos, no tienes las sorpresas Y claro, es lo que hemos comentado antes. La lectura que tiene el autor, que tiene él de Ventiladores Clive, es muy distinta que con nosotros, que hay que dejar, cuando dejas algo de interpretación del público, no sabes si dejar mucho, si dejar poco. Pero bueno, yo creo que estas dos obras tienen bastante a la interpretación, aunque los temas están bastante claros. Pues yo creo que ya cortamos, ¿no? Que habrá que dar tiempo para ir a cenar. Gracias a todos por venir. Gracias por haber estado en esta conversación tan buena. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having us.
What's the name you want? Diego or Seth?
Oh, no, Seth. I go by
Seth.
Seth. Well, let me thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It's complicated. You are my first very good
Oh, great.
Es para una amiga, una es para mí y otra para una amiga. No sé dónde poner, pongo el calcetín.
Bueno, ya estamos organizados.
You want your name. So I will get you to write your name so I don't misspell it. So that's a common word. Let me give you a pen here. There we go. All this stuff out of the way. I can sign things properly.
Do you want me to take these?
Yes.
I was and he is taking the first.
That's very kind. I appreciate that. That's really nice.